There's a question almost every working adult on Earth quietly asks themselves. Why does it feel like no matter how hard I work, I'm never actually moving forward? You work longer hours than your parents. You're more educated than your grandparents. You have more technology, more tools, more access, more information, everything that should make life easier, and yet somehow, you feel poorer. But what if I told you, it's not your fault at all? What if I told you the struggle you feel is engineered? Your rent is higher, your groceries cost more, your salary doesn't stretch like it used to, and every year, it feels like you're running faster just to stay exactly where you are. This is what people call the rat race. But today, I want to show you something most people never realize. The rat race isn't a lifestyle. It's an economic mechanism, a global system, a design. And once you see the pattern clearly, you'll never unsee it again. Because your personal struggle, the long hours, the shrinking savings, the growing bills, is not a personal failure. It's the symptom of a 400-year global debt machine that has shaped every empire, every collapse, and every financial crisis, from the Dutch Golden Age to today. So let's begin. Most people think the rat race is cultural. You buy things to look successful. You work hard to climb the corporate ladder. You take loans to get a house, a car, a phone, and you're never done paying. But the truth is much darker. You didn't choose the rat race. The rat race chose you. Here's how it works. You enter adulthood with no assets, rising costs of living, no safety net, and a financial system that requires you to borrow from day one. You take a student loan. You take a mortgage. You take a credit card. You take a pay-later installment. You take a car loan. You take a personal loan for emergencies. And each one keeps you locked into one thing: perpetual work. Because the moment you stop working, everything collapses. Bills don't stop. Loans don't sleep. Interest doesn't take a holiday. And that's the first shocking truth. You're not stuck in the rat race because you're stuck in the rat race because the global economy requires you to be. So if the world needs you trapped, then what exactly is this machine running on? Let that sink in. Now, let's look at why. Here's where the puzzle pieces finally click. When most people think of money, they imagine something simple. You earn money, you save money, you spend money. But the modern economy doesn't work like that. Instead, it works like this. Money equals debt. Every dollar in your wallet, every rupiah in your bank account, every euro in your paycheck, almost all of it was created by someone taking a loan. Governments borrow money. Corporations borrow money. Consumers borrow money. Banks create money through lending. Central banks expand credit to stimulate growth. The system is built on one assumption: debt must always grow. And that leads to another shocking truth. If the world stopped taking loans tomorrow, the global economy would collapse within months. GDP would fall. Stock markets would crash. Corporations would freeze. Governments would default. Banks would fail. Because debt isn't a problem in this system. Debt is the system. And once you see how deep this goes, everything about your life will suddenly make sense. People often ask, why does my salary stay the same, but everything else gets more expensive? There's a simple answer: inflation is engineered. Not always directly, but structurally. Governments need inflation. Banks need inflation. Corporations need inflation. Debt-based systems require inflation. Because inflation does one important thing: it destroys the value of your savings. Why is that important? Because if your money kept rising in value, you would save, not spend. And if people save instead of borrow, the system collapses. So inflation becomes a quiet tax, a slow erosion of your time, your effort, your life energy. Every year you run faster. Every year the finish line moves farther away. Now let's zoom out, way out, because this is not modern. This is not new. In fact, the blueprint of the rat race was discovered 400 years ago. The rat race began the moment global powers discovered something incredible. An economy built on debt is extremely powerful and extremely fragile. And no company in history proves this better than the VOC. Did you know that the idea of debt is as old as civilization itself? But the way we use it today, on a massive global scale, really kicked off with a bunch of spice traders a few hundred years ago? Let's talk about the history of debt and how it shaped the world we live in. Before money, there was debt. In ancient Mesopotamia, farmers would borrow seeds and promise to pay back a portion of their harvest. These debts were recorded on clay tablets. Fast forward through centuries, and while the concept remained, the scale was about to explode. Enter the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, in the early 1600s. The VOC had a bold plan: to sail across the globe, control the insanely profitable spice trade, and build a massive empire. But these voyages were incredibly expensive and risky. A single ship could cost a fortune, and there was no guarantee it would return. So, how did they fund this? They came up with a revolutionary idea. Instead of relying on a few wealthy backers, the VOC offered shares to the general public. Anyone from a rich merchant to a humble baker could buy a piece of the company. This made the VOC the world's first publicly traded company. But they didn't stop there. They also issued bonds. A bond is essentially a loan. You give the VOC money, and they promise to pay you back later, with interest. This was a game changer. The VOC raised enormous amounts of capital, allowing them to build a fleet of over 4,000 ships, established colonies, and even waged their own wars. They essentially invented corporate debt as we know it, financing long-term growth by borrowing from the future. The city of Amsterdam became the world's first modern financial hub, all built on this new system of shares and bonds. Now, governments were watching closely. For centuries, kings and queens had to beg, borrow, and sometimes even steal to finance their wars and lavish lifestyles. But this new model offered a more civilized approach. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, took this idea and ran with it. It was created specifically to lend money to the government. How did it work? The bank would issue banknotes. Basically, IOS and lend them to the government. The government would use this money to fund its army and navy. In return, the government guaranteed the bank's loans, making them a very safe investment. People trusted these banknotes because they were backed by the full faith and credit of the British government. This is the birth of national debt. This new financial firepower allowed Britain to build a global empire that dwarfed even the VO. They could afford to fight prolonged wars, like the Napoleonic Wars, by simply borrowing more money. Their rivals, who still relied on clunky old methods of taxation, just couldn't keep up. National debt became a strategic weapon. This brings us to the modern era. Today, almost every government in the world runs on debt. When you hear about the US national debt being trillions of dollars, it's the same basic principle started by the Bank of England. Governments issue bonds to raise money for everything from building roads and schools to funding social security and defense. So, is all this debt a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's complicated. On one hand, debt fuels progress. It allows companies to innovate and expand, creating jobs and new products. It allows governments to provide essential services and respond to crises, like a pandemic or a financial crash. Imagine if we had to pay for a new hospital or a high-speed rail line with only the cash we have on hand. It would be nearly impossible. Debt allows us to invest in our future, but there's a flip side. Too much debt can be dangerous. For a company, if it can't generate enough profit to pay back its loans, it can go bankrupt. For a country, a massive national debt can lead to higher taxes, cuts in public services, and even economic instability. If investors start to worry that a government might not be able to pay back its bonds, they'll demand higher interest rates, making the debt even more expensive. This can create a vicious cycle that's hard to escape. We also see debt on a personal level. Mortgages allow us to buy homes, student loans help us get an education, and credit cards let us make purchases. These tools can be incredibly helpful for building a better life, but they also come with risks. And when not managed carefully, personal debt can become a heavy burden, causing immense stress and financial hardship. So, from ancient clay tablets to the VOC's spice ships, and from the Bank of England's war chest to the digital ledgers of today, debt has been a powerful force. It's a tool that has built empires, fueled revolutions, and shaped the very fabric of our modern economy. It allows us to dream big and invest in tomorrow, but it also demands responsibility and careful management. Understanding its history helps us understand the world we live in today, a world built, for better or worse, on credit. What do you think? Is debt a necessary engine for progress, or a ticking time bomb? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you found this interesting, be sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into how our world works. Every empire in history collapses the exact same way. They borrow too much, debase their currency, and trap workers in poverty to keep the system alive. The VOC did it, Rome did it, the British Empire did it, the Ottoman Empire did it, and now, the entire modern world is doing it together. Except this time, the stakes are global. Let's return to the present. Look at any major stock index: America, Japan, Europe, China. You'll find a growing number of companies that are technically alive, but only because they keep borrowing money to survive. These are called zombie corporations. A zombie company can generate enough profit to pay interest, relies on endless refinancing, uses debt to cover operating expenses, needs low interest rates to avoid bankruptcy. Low-ingingly, in some countries, over 20% of major corporations fall into this category. What does this mean? It means the free market isn't free. It means failure isn't allowed to happen. It means corporations survive not by strength, but by borrowing. And it means this: if interest rates rise even slightly, zombies die. And when zombies die, the entire system collapses. Because they're not small businesses. They're huge. They employ millions. They sit inside major indexes. They supply critical goods. They owe trillions. And here's the connection to you. When zombie companies take on more debt, they cut costs. And cost cutting means one thing: wages stay low, so you get cheaper labor, more pressure, bigger workloads, fewer raises, worse conditions. Why? Because debt consumes everything. The VOC learned that in 1799, Rome learned that in 276 AD, and today, the world is learning the same lesson. And when these giants fall, they won't fall alone. Here's where everything comes together: the rat race. Government borrowing, corporate debt, wage stagnation, inflation, and historical collapse. Because the global economy has crossed a threshold. One it can never return from. We have reached a point where global debt exceeds $300 trillion most. Major governments cannot repay their debt. Interest payments exceed tax revenue. Corporations depend on perpetual borrowing, depend on credit for survival. Inflation erodes savings faster than wages can rise it. Economies collapse without ever expanding credit. This is the endgame of a debt-based system. There is no return to normal. Normal requires productivity-driven growth, but the past 30 years have been death-driven growth. Normal requires money backed by value, but today's money is backed by confidence and nothing else. Normal requires wages rising with costs, but the system cannot survive that. The modern global economy is no longer held together by productivity, trade, or innovation. It is held together by borrowing against the future. We are living inside a bubble 400 years in the making, and this is where part 3 will take us. The final stage of debt economies, how global powers try to escape collapse, why inflation becomes the last tool, the socioeconomic breaking point, the trap ordinary people feel every day, and the build-up to the most explosive section, the collapse pattern that never fails. Every debt-based system in history passes through 4 stages before collapse. Stage 1. Expansion. Credit grows, debt fuels growth, people feel richer, governments encourage prosperity. Prices rise, wages seem okay, this is the golden age. Stage 2. Dependency. Debt becomes essential, banks become powerful, corporations rely on leverage, governments borrow to cover deficits, consumers borrow to maintain lifestyle. This is when the system becomes addicted. Stage 3. Fragility. Debt grows faster than productivity, wages stagnate, inflation rises, people fall behind, savings shrink, asset bubbles appear. This is where the rat race becomes suffocating. Stage 4. Decline. Currency debasement, social unrest, political instability, falling living standards, collapse of trust in institutions. When trust dies, the system dies. Every empire walked these steps, including the VOC, Rome, and now the entire global economy. And the shocking truth: we are not early in this cycle, we are at the end. The evidence is everywhere, in wages, in debt, in inflation, in the desperation of governments and central banks. The machine is breaking down. So the real question becomes, what happens next? When economies reach the point where debt becomes unmanageable, governments have only 3 options, and every one of them hurts ordinary people. Let's break them down. This is the most common strategy. Governments allow or engineer inflation because inflation does something magical and terrifying. It makes old debt cheaper. If inflation is 10% and you borrowed money last year, your real debt shrinks. For governments drowning in trillions of dollars of obligations, inflation becomes a lifesaver. But here's the problem. Inflation saves governments by sacrificing workers. Your salary doesn't rise at the same pace. Your savings lose value. Your purchasing power falls. Your life gets harder. Inflation becomes the quiet thief in the night. This is when governments force savers into losing positions. Low interest rates, high inflation, restricted capital flows, mandatory participation in bonds, currency controls, frozen bank withdrawals, taxes on savings. You become the shock absorber of the economy. Your money is trapped inside a system bleeding value. When inflation and repression fail, governments cut spending, reduced social programs, lower pensions, higher taxes, fewer public services, delayed projects, smaller benefits, wage freezes. Austerity hits the weakest members of society first. Yet even this is not enough to stop a collapse, merely to delay it. Every solution governments use to save the economy makes life worse for the people inside it, which is why you're seeing the rat race intensify around you. The system isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed to preserve itself. And when a system fights for survival, it doesn't care who it hurts. Have you ever felt like the world is on a knife's edge? Like the systems we've relied on for decades are starting to crack under pressure? You're not alone. It's not just a feeling. It's a reality we're all navigating. From our supply chains to our financial markets, the intricate web that holds our global system together is showing signs of serious strain. And today, we're going to dive deep into what's happening, why it matters, and most importantly, what comes next. Let's rewind a bit. For the past 70+ years, we've lived in a world largely shaped by globalization. This system promised efficiency, lower costs, and greater interconnectedness. Companies could manufacture goods wherever it was cheapest, and we, the consumers, enjoyed an abundance of affordable products. Financial capital could flow freely across borders, chasing the best returns. It was a complex, beautiful, and incredibly fragile dance. The core idea was that countries would become so economically intertwined that major conflicts would be unthinkable. Why fight when you can trade? For a while, it seemed to work. But this hyper-optimized system had a hidden vulnerability. It sacrificed resilience for efficiency. Think of it like a finely tuned race car. It's incredibly fast and efficient on a smooth track, but a single pothole can cause a catastrophic failure. Our global system was that race car, and the last few years have been one giant pothole after another. The pandemic was the first major shock. Suddenly, a virus in one part of the world could shut down factories on the other side of the planet, leaving our store shelves empty. We learned the hard way that having our entire supply of essential goods, from masks to microchips, depend on a handful of distant factories was a massive risk. The phrase supply chain went from boring business jargon to a headline-grabbing crisis overnight. Then came the geopolitical tremors. Conflicts and rising tensions between major powers have thrown another wrench into the works. What used to be a relatively cooperative global stage has turned into a competitive arena. We're seeing a rise in protectionism, countries putting up trade barriers, prioritizing their own national interests, and becoming wary of depending on geopolitical rivals for critical resources. This process, often called deglobalization or fragmentation, is like a slow-motion breakup. Countries are reevaluating their economic partnerships, not just based on cost, but on trust and security. They refriend-shoring, moving production to allied nations, and reshoring, bringing it back home. This shift is fundamentally rewriting the rules of the global economy. It's messy, it's expensive, and it creates a ton of uncertainty. And we can't ignore the financial side of this story. For years, the global financial system has been fueled by cheap money and massive amounts of debt. Central banks kept interest rates near zero to stimulate growth. But now, with inflation soaring to levels not seen in 40 years, that era is over. Central banks are hiking rates aggressively to cool things down. This is like hitting the brakes on that race car we talked about. It's necessary to avoid a crash, but the sudden stop is jarring. It makes it more expensive for companies and governments to borrow money, squeezing budgets and increasing the risk of defaults. We're seeing currency fluctuations, stock market volatility, and a general sense of unease creeping into financial markets around the world. The stability we took for granted is being tested like never before. So, we have fragile supply chains, geopolitical fragmentation, and a shaky financial system all happening at once. It's a perfect storm. Each problem feeds into the others, creating a feedback loop of instability. For example, geopolitical tensions disrupt energy supplies, which drives up inflation, forcing central banks to raise interest rates, which then puts stress on indebted nations and companies, potentially leading to even more instability. It's a complex and interconnected crisis. But here's the crucial point. Collapse doesn't necessarily mean apocalypse. It's not about the end of the world, but the end of the world asterisk as we know it. Asterisk? Systems don't just vanish, they transform. The collapse of the old system is clearing the way for something new to be built. What might this new system look like? Well, we're likely heading towards a more multipolar world. Instead of one or two dominant powers, we'll see several regional blocs, each with its own economic sphere of influence, its own supply chains, and maybe even its own currency systems. Think of it less like a single global village and more like a neighborhood of distinct, semi-independent compounds. This new world will be less efficient but potentially more resilient. Countries will prioritize self-sufficiency and security over pure cost savings. This means more local production, shorter supply chains, and a renewed focus on domestic industries. For us as individuals, this could mean that some goods become more expensive or harder to find. The era of instant gratification and endless cheap stuff might be coming to an end. But on the flip side, it could also lead to more local jobs, stronger communities, and a more sustainable way of living. This transition will be bumpy. There will be challenges, disruptions, and periods of uncertainty. Navigating this new landscape requires a shift in our mindset. We need to become more adaptable, more resilient, and more informed. Understanding these massive global shifts is the first step. It's not about fingering, it's about being prepared. Just like you'd check the weather before a long hike, we need to understand the economic and geopolitical climate to make smart decisions for ourselves and our families. What can we do on a personal level? Focus on what you can control, building practical skills, diversifying your income streams, and strengthening your local community connections are all powerful steps. Instead of relying entirely on fragile, distant systems, we can build resilience right where we are. Pay attention to how these big trends are playing out. Stay curious, ask questions, and don't get swept up in the panic. The world is changing, yes, but change always brings opportunity. The breakdown of one system is the breakthrough of another. By understanding the forces at play, we can not only weather the storm, but also help shape the more resilient and localized world that comes next. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. I know it's a heavy topic, but it's one of the most important conversations we can be having right now. If you found this insightful, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content that helps you make sense of our complex world. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay curious, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next video. This is the part almost nobody sees coming. The opposite of the rat race is not luxury, it's simplicity. Imagine this. A smaller home made cheaper, car fewer, wants lower bills, no debt, more time better, health more sleep, calm days stronger, relationships quiet mornings, a mind that isn't constantly drowning in cello. Living is not retreating from life, it is reclaiming it. It's the only strategy the system cannot monetize, and that makes it the most powerful. Because the rat race depends on one thing, you wanting more than you need. When you stop wanting, the race loses its control over you. You don't need to beat the system, you simply stop feeding it. The global financial system has a cycle. Debt gives inflation, gives stagnation, gives collapse. But your life can have a different cycle. Discipline gives savings, savings gives investment, gives freedom, gives time, gives health, gives clear, thinking gives better decisions gives more freedom. This is the opposite of the rat race. This is the human cycle, the sustainable cycle, the cycle you control. You were never failing, you were never behind, you were never inadequate, you were never lazy, you were never not working hard enough. You were simply living in a system that takes value faster than you can create. It inflates prices faster than wages grows debt, faster than the economy traps people to sustain growth punishes. Saver swords borrower slates assets beyond reach keeps people racing while moving the finish line. Once you see the machine, you stop blaming yourself, you stop comparing yourself, you stop chasing illusions, and you start doing the one thing the system fears most: thinking clearly, because people who think clearly are impossible to control. You don't escape the rat race by running faster. You escape by choosing a different road. A road where your time belongs to your money serves your life. ISNT, dictated by debt to your value. ISNT, measured by consumption and your future. ISNT, chained to a collapsing system. This is where the story ends, and where your freedom begins.